This is the Fly Culture Podcast with me, your host, Pete Tigers. Welcome everyone to the very latest Fly Culture Podcast. Today I'm sitting down with Nick Measham, fly fisherman and Deputy Chief Executive of the Salmon and Trout Conservation. We've had, instead of usually with our podcasts, we go and do some fishing afterwards. We've changed it around this morning actually and done some fishing this morning. And for me, it encapsulated exactly why I love fishing so much, in that it's some friends sharing shots at the fish. It's November, we had some rising grayling, we caught some fish, and it's just one of those perfect moments, and like I say, it encapsulates exactly why I love fishing so much. But Nick, it's great to sit down and have a chat with you. I'm hoping to pick your brains about what the Salmon and Trout Conservation are up to, about the hatches on rivers, the Smart Rivers project and bits and pieces like that, and also learn a little bit about you as a fly angler as well. So Nick, thank you for coming along.
Pleasure.
How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Very well indeed. As I say, we've had this fantastic morning, and I mean on my home turf, the chalk streams, and it's great even at this time of year to see a prolific hatch of upwing flies, probably pale wateries, and grayling and trout feeding avidly.
Like I was saying to you when we were on the river, you know, the amazing thing about it has been, at home I'm heavy into nymphs and I'm fishing 3 or 4 mil of tungsten to try and get down and find those grayling. We do get them in the West Country rising October sort of time, sometimes into November, but that's about it. So it's been a real pleasure for me to make some casts at rising fish and, you know, doing the old spotting the bubble in the rise, which is, as we all know, a pretty good clue that it could well be a grayling, and to go catch a few as well. So it's been fantastic. I mean,
it is fantastic, and I'm very lucky because I live near Salisbury, so I live between the Hampshire Avon and the chalk streams of Hampshire. So it's very, very spoiling, and I love going and fishing elsewhere because then it really does test you when you in other ways. Here, it's such a visual activity. You can see what's going on, and you can see the fish. You can target them quite easily, and even when you're nymph fishing, quite often it's sight fishing. So I'm not sure that many chalk stream anglers would actually make the England team that's just gone off to Australia to try and come back with a World Cup of some sort or other. But because of that fact, because there's so much of fishing elsewhere, you'll be targeting and fishing a particular water, searching for fish, not actually fishing them to sight. But here we've got that ability to be able to sight fish for the fish. And although you get quite a lot of people complaining about the lack of fly life and so on, I tend to find that if you know what you're looking for and you put the time in, there's plenty of fly. As we saw today, actually, you couldn't fault the fact. I mean, fish were rising several, at the same time throughout a 2.5, 3 hour session.
Mm. Yeah, it was, last night I was fishing alone and it was dark and there were fish rising and it was just amazing to be able to do that. And for me, as you exactly say, the visual aspect is the thing for me that I love when I get the chance to fish a chalk stream, rather, as you rightly said, rather than fishing the water. And it's a real pleasure to do that. And I'm always reminded of the Winchester Cathedral and the Isaac Walton and Study to be Patient. And I did a bit of that yesterday. I was so excited to be able to fish.
But, it's really interesting because that's actually, I've been lucky enough to meet some fantastic fishermen, such as Oliver Edwards, for example, who's represented his country on river fishing and is probably one of the greatest fly tyers that there has ever been. And Ollie will come down here fishing with me for grayling, but when he comes down during the season trout fishing, trying to train him out of his North Country habits of casting and fishing the water and learning to sort of study to be quiet, sitting still, waiting for it to happen, and that's the chalk stream sort of the key to it, basically.
Yeah, and that's where I was coming from. I guess that's what it says in the fisherman's area in the cathedral there. And you know, I'm not a religious man, but I had to go and see the stained glass window of him saying, and I think it is studied to be patient or something. So I got myself down there. I was shaking with excitement, sat on the bench, watched the fish. I wanted to see the bubble just because there was the chance that trout might be rising, and I really didn't want to catch those, and just waited and caught a couple of fish, and I was super pleased with that in complete darkness. So, and
that's
again,
fantastic.
Yeah, it encapsulates again why I love this. And I know we were chatting while we were taking our waders off, and I think now even I'm loving fly fishing more than I ever have done, if that's possible.
Well, I think it's the same for me, actually. Funnily enough, I was asked this the other day by somebody, and they said, because my life has got busier in other respects with salmon and trout conservation, how do you cope sort of working more and fishing less than you were a few years ago? And the answer is that I don't know. But I enjoy the fishing I do at the moment. I enjoy more than I've ever enjoyed it. And I'm certainly not catching any more fish. And for me, in my own mind, the pressure's off. I, like anybody else who goes fishing, I like to get my fix, get a fish, get a fish to take the fly, bring it to hand. But once I've done that, then everything else is a bonus, and that's how I approach it now. And it is just a fantastic way to spend time.
Do you think that comes with age? And I've noticed the same as I've got older. It's not sort of running to the river. I've got to cast. And you could almost... And last night, I probably could have caught another fish, but I caught that one. I'd caught a couple previously, and I caught that one. I really wanted to try and catch it. I caught it. That was fine. I released it and snipped my fly off and wound in, and that was enough.
Yeah, I guess it is. I mean, I used to behave differently when I was younger. I'm now older, and I think that is a factor. I know I used to really want to be and be really quite competitive in. You go on a fishing trip with your friends, and you'd want to make sure that you were not underperforming. But now I've got a completely different mindset. I'm much more interested in understanding what's going on, how the fish are. I mean, I remember once the late great Ori Vigfusson, who I was lucky enough to know quite well, telling me that with salmon fishing, we went on a trip somewhere, and he wasn't fishing particularly hard. I think he caught a couple of fish, but the rest of us had caught more. I'm wondering, I asked him, is there something the matter? He said, no. He said, it's lovely to be here. I just want to know that the fish are there. I know they are there. I've caught some. I'm completely happy. And actually, that's an attitude of mine that I think does develop over time.
And it's nice that, you know, the three of us fishing, and Brett was with us as well, that, you know, you take it in turns. And I get as much pleasure out of somebody catching a fish as catching one myself. And, you know, when somebody was in, oh, nice one, and, you know, that's part of it, isn't it? And you lose those competitive...
You do. I mean,
as you get older, I think.
It is really interesting, actually. And I, you know, to the extent I'm now really quite happy sharing a rod with somebody. No problem at all. I used to think that would be an impossible thing to do. But I discovered this in Iceland one year, that, well, salmon fishing in Iceland is pretty expensive, and basically to defray costs, a friend and I, a very, very good friend with whom I fish quite a lot, decided to share a rod salmon fishing on the lower part of the river that's called the Big Laxer in the northeast of Iceland, and it was absolutely fine. Both of us had been worried, or particularly my mate John Browning was concerned that I would get twitchy if I wasn't fishing all the time. But I said to him that I'd learned from an Icelandic friend with whom I'd fished with before, the Icelandic approach to rod sharing, and that is you just basically, every fish is a team fish. So they keep a meticulous record of catches, and in the lodge in the evening, you write in both of your names against all of the fish. So it's a team effort. And that completely changes the dynamic, which is it's interesting. And I think I'd recommend anyone trying it, because Then part of the time you can sit and watch somebody else fish, and you can sit and think, and it just makes for a much more relaxed and enjoyable experience.
Funny you should mention that, because Brett, who is our creative director, has written a piece in the winter edition of the magazine about that exact topic. So he went with George Kavanagh, who shot the cover of the winter edition, fabulous photographer, and he writes a piece about how exciting it was to see everything unfold, catch the fish and everything else that went with it, which I think was I think our readers find kind of interesting, and sort of goes in backs up exactly what you said. So let's take you back to, where did fly fishing start for you?
Gosh, how did fishing start for me? Well, I grew up in the industrial West Midlands, which is not exactly blessed with
trout streams,
trout streams, and certainly there's quite a few little rivers, but most of them were badly polluted in the mid '60s, when I was becoming aware of water. How it all happened is my parents bought me a fishing rod on a family caravanning holiday. We used to get, I'm the eldest of 4 children, and we were crammed into a car, towed a caravan, a 14-foot caravan, so a caravan that was actually shorter than the salmon rods that I fished with, up to Scotland, and all 6 of us somehow were fitting into these caravans. And it was the summer of 1968, and it was hot, sunny weather. We were staying somewhere near a caravan site on the River Tummel near Pitlochry. Unbeknown to, I don't know what had happened, but one day my dad took me into a shop. It was a local fishing tackle shop. It was a Drapers and Doubles tackle shop, and bought me a small 5-foot long solid fiberglass spinning rod with a little fixed spool reel and line and bits and pieces. And that's when it all started. I didn't start fly fishing for several years, but I locked into it. With that rod, we were given the Norris Shakespeare. That was the name of the company that at that time was that had done the rod kit. A sort of rather upmarket catalogue. I've still got it, in fact. And this catalogue had sections on various forms of fishing. To somehow or other, the idea of fly fishing, then for trout, because given our circumstances, salmon fishing just seemed like something that's just completely beyond anything I could possibly contemplate. But the idea of fly fishing with an imitation of an insect, and getting a fish to take that imitating what it's feeding on and getting it to take it, struck me as just a fantastic way of fishing. And it completely captivated me. Having said that, the fishing opportunities we were living in Walsall, were pretty limited to fishing in the local park pond and not catching very much. Maybe the occasional small roach or perch. So that's how I started fishing. But the fly fishing then began through taking books out of the local library and learning. And I think when I was about 11 or 12, I managed to cobble together enough pocket money and paper round money to buy a fly rod. The problem was I didn't really have anywhere to go and fish with it, other than when we went on these family holidays, and then we would go and stay in caravan sites by rivers, and often the caravan sites by the river had some free fishing thrown in, and I'd be there trying to learn how to fly fish. So that's how it sort of happened, and it sort of gradually grew from there. I was my parents moved to the East Midlands, to Bedford, which is again not blessed with trout streams, but is only a short distance from a number of reservoirs, Pittsford and Graffham, and that became my focus. So I started reading up on it. I saved up and bought a fibre tube blank and built a 9-foot 6-weight fly rod. Saved up for the line for it, I bought a Kingfisher silk line because I thought I could use it both greased for float surface work and allow it to sink, because I couldn't afford to have a sinking and a floating line. A fly tying kit, tied my own flies, and then every so often when I'd saved off enough money for a ticket, would get my parents to take me to Grafham or Pitsford, leave me there for the day, and I'd fish away on the banks and see what happened.
That's really lovely, and listening to that story, it seems to me that because you had to, and having chatted to you earlier and stuff, I can see how passionate you are about fly fishing, and having to save up for the line while you already had the rod makes that passion burn brighter, because you've got to wait such a time, and everything must have been special when you could afford to buy the fly line.
It was actually. I mean, sort of. They were special moments, and when actually equally special when I managed to catch a fish. I've still got some of the flies I tied then. I was again. Dick Walker was one of the big names in fishing in those days, and he produced a book of fly dressings, and I remember tying his sort of longhorn sedge pupa and things like this, and some various buzzer patterns. I never did have much success with buzzers, but the longhorn sedge pupa fished from the dam wall at Grafham at certain times, that caught me one or two fish, and I didn't catch many fish because I probably wasn't learning my craft and just finding my way, but I can remember almost, you can remember those fish as clearly now, 45, 50 years ago, as I can remember some of the fish I caught this morning. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for working away at these things and working to get these things, and I think things that don't come easily mean an awful lot more.
Yes, basically.
So that I was very lucky in that sense that I was sort of a self-taught and had to spend a lot of time thinking about what I was doing. It was amazing, and it was a really interesting time in that a lot of the people I used to fish with, I managed to tag along with a group of people who used to meet in the RAF club, in the reserve club or whatever in Bedford, and for some reason I pestered them and they would take me along to the reservoirs as well sometimes, but their techniques were very different. Often they go off, and some of them would go in a boat, which wasn't an option for me. Otherwise they'd often fish with lures, and I'd try that a bit, but I just felt that it was, you'd see trout rising and moving in the reservoirs, and I really wanted to catch them on imitations of what they were feeding on, and it seemed to be a much more fruitful way of fishing to work out what the fish are eating, work out where the food, and where that food is most likely to be in abundance, and therefore that's where the fish are going to be, and work out a way of trying to catch them. And a book which was extremely influential to me in all of my fishing, though it was about stillwater at the time, was a book called The Pursuit of Stillwater Trout by Brian Clark. Yeah. It was an amazing book because he had gone through, in his own trout fishing, going to reservoirs, looking at this big expanse of water, hurling out a team of a lure or a team of wet flies and retrieving them, and very often not catching anything. And then he went through this metamorphosis when he became then a very skilled sort of stillwater fisherman, pursuing fish with imitations of what they were eating.
The other name, funnily enough, when you were mentioning that, and I have that book myself as well, which is wonderful with the plates with the flies in, and the other one, when you mentioned fishing those places, was Arthur Cove as well. Would he have been?
Yes, Arthur Cove was at around the same time. I didn't meet Arthur Cove, but his book, and I did try to fish his deep nymph techniques.
Red Diddy and...
Did I? I'm not sure I ever had a great deal of success doing it, but I spent a lot of time tying his sort of giant, long-shanked pheasant tail type nymphs with and so on. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating person to get into, and his book again is a fascinating read, and I'm sure those techniques would continue to work to this day. But he was another great man, and there was and then another big name of the time was Bob Church.
Of course.
Yeah, the late Bob Church. And Bob Church, well, both Brian Clark and Bob Church are people later in life who I've been lucky enough to meet, and both were in their own way exceptional anglers.
And it's different. I've had this conversation before. It seems a little bit different today in that you can become an expert pretty quickly, but those days those guys had to go out, get beaten up by the fish sometimes, but they would learn from it, and then they would write a book having learnt that sort of thing. And it seems as though, not that it's a bad thing, but things seem to be slightly different. The path seems to be a lot quicker now than having to really sort of, pictures of fish and stuff, but there's the background stuff and the patterns and things like that. And I've said before that,
it's the patterns, the techniques, the technology, I suppose.
Yes.
I mean, modern competitive resi fishing is quite often it's on the surface, and one of the things that used to amaze me was going to reservoirs and you see trout rising, and you point it out to people, and you'd think, well, I'll try a dry fly and it would work. But other people say, yeah, that's interesting, but these almost the assumption these fish will only take a lure fish back under the surface, so you don't need to do the dry fly fishing. Then one or two competition fishermen sort of picked up on the fact that dry fly fishing had worked quite well, and then that developed. But equally, the point I was going to make was that the other end of the spectrum, people learnt much more about the rainbow trout and how they sit at different, in different sort of layers of the lake, at different sort of temperatures for targeting different sorts of food, and that combined with fast sinking lines, and then foam by boobies, flies that float, allowed you to utilise those sorts of techniques. And I guess people just know an awful lot more nowadays.
And it's easier to share.
And the information is shared, basically. Whereas, I suppose when going back going back to the 1970s, and you had to wait for your monthly dose of trout and salmon and magazine, and hope that was discussing something germane to what you were focused on. But otherwise, the internet didn't exist, so that dissemination of information was very slow.
Yeah, no, it's so quick. And you see fly patterns now on, how quickly they're evolving, come into vogue, go out of vogue, and everything's really, really quick now, isn't it? And we've been, I was fishing an old Griffiths Nat and worked absolutely fine.
Well,
it's
the
funny,
old patterns still basically still work. And I was coming back to it's interesting actually. I'm not anywhere near skillful enough fly tie to tie very complicated patterns, but I'm lucky enough to have, as I say, spent time with people like Oliver Edwards, and he just showed me some very basic generic patterns, which form the staple diet of my chalk stream fly selections.
I've done that also with my salmon fishing now, and I'm fishing traditional patterns, the Lady Caroline, some of the steelhead traditional patterns like the Greenbuck skunk, stuff like that are and they work just as well, and they've got those trigger points on them, and that's all I fished in Oregon actually recently.
Amazing. A couple of years ago, I was invited to fish on the in the spring, on the quite early spring. I think it was in early-ish April, on the River Oikel, and there they have a rule that you fish simply with single hook. So if you're fishing a tube fly, it's with a single hook, and if you're fishing with a traditional fly, it's a single hook fly. And I was amazed how well those single hooks work. And there on the Oikel also, even though the water was coolish, but by tradition, as soon as it makes any sense whatsoever, they fish with a floating line. So I'm fishing with a floating line and a longish leader, and thinking, well, I think I'd be happy with a sink tip, and feeling rather sort of, I'm not sure this is going to work, when I get a nice steady knock, pull, and I'm into a fish. And I then think, well, this single hook's going to come out.
Yeah.
And no, it didn't. And there I am, I'm then long of 14 pounds of very fresh Springer. Yeah. It was absolutely fantastic. So those traditional things, and I enjoy doing things like that. I mean, I must admit that on chalk streams, for olive imitations, I fish with CDC flies that I just type myself. I don't put any hackle on them, generally speaking, because it seems like too much. It just doesn't seem to be necessary. But in other situations, fishing with traditional patterns is fantastic.
I put myself through it when as just mentioned, in Oregon. I didn't take any intruders for the steelhead.
No,
I just took March Browns, the Lady Carolines and stuff. And
those
just
wonderful traditional. I think they're mostly traditional spay patterns.
Yeah, they just look wonderful.
Oh, they do look fantastic, and they fish fantastically. And I agree with you. And it's when the fish takes. The beauty of some of those things is that those single hooks anchor the fly dressing nicely. They fish. They
just looks good.
When you look at them,
the
they just
angle.
look. Yeah. The whole thing just feels right.
Yes.
And then when a fish takes, you see the take. Those flies are fishing close to the surface, and it's spectacular.
Yeah, my wife got me into it because a good friend of ours, Duncan Rayner, ties exquisite flies, and he tied her some acroids and balmorals, and she fished them, and she was catching fish on them. I remember, even for my talking about social media, I took a photo of the balmoral, and 5 minutes later I took a photo of her holding a grilse that she just caught on the balmoral, and that was just wonderful. She has no qualms about that's what she likes to do, and it's influenced me to a great degree as well.
Well, I mean, I think, like we were saying a bit earlier, actually, that I'm a much more relaxed fisherman now than I was even 10 years ago. And actually, for me, I get pleasure out of every aspect of it. If I'm casting well, I feel I'm fishing well, and I like to fish, and I really enjoy fishing with techniques that give me pleasure. And I learnt a lot from fishing with a Dane in Iceland, a Danish guy called Klaus Freemore, who basically fishes with floating lines and long leaders and relatively small flies most of the time. I have this debate and think, well, crikey, shouldn't I be fishing with getting down a bit deeper? And he would say, no point. These fish will come up. And relatively fresh salmon will do that, I think. But and on other rivers, one of my favourite places to fish is this river, the Big Laxer in northeast Iceland. It's not for salmon fishing, it's not the most prolific, and it's an annoyingly difficult river because it has weed in it throughout the year because it comes from a fairly rich, nutrient-rich lake, and so there's bits of drifting weed. You tend to have to therefore fish with a floating line whether you like it or not, and you often fish with a single hook fly, so you then snap the weed off. And the lies aren't always obvious. You've got to get things. In certain places, it can be like any other salmon river, but in other places, you've got to get things spot on. But it's a tremendously rewarding place to fish, and it has some really big, by Icelandic standards, you can quite comfortably expect if you're catching fish, one of them in your holiday will be a £20 fish.
Wow!
So it's remarkable, and those salmon will come up.
Wow.
So I suspect we spend a lot of time fishing here. More deep than that, and we take fish on deep, but that's because we're doing that. We're not actually necessarily fishing as close to the surface
I think part of it as well is the psychological aspect.
Yeah.
So if you've got a niggling doubt in your mind, you're not going to probably be fishing what you're fishing as well. And I've got this thing in my head that when I was guiding, that if I had the choice between a gold-ribbed hare's ear and a pheasant tail, it would be a pheasant tail 99 times out of 100. And I would be sitting there. Sometimes I might put a pheasant tail on when the mayfly are getting going down on my home river, but I'm not fishing it as a guide for my person as confidently. So I make the change and you catch fish. Now you don't know, but if you're not fishing it confidently, you're not going to fish it as well, are you? I don't think.
No.
So those things are.
But it's exactly one of those things. But sometimes you have to do things that, and it's great fun having a guide who will take you out of your comfort zone and show you that different things work. And I'll never forget, again, this is salmon fishing, that I had read about hitching, but I'd never really tried it. And then on one Icelandic holiday, I'd sort of been playing around with, and I thought I got close to hitching with a sunray shadow, which I'd used to great effect in this country, in Scotland, on salmon.
Hitching that as well?
Well, come on, I was actually fishing it sort of casting square, downstream end and stripping it back in the sort of, like I say, inverted commas approved or Scottish gillies sort of technique for stirring up fish, which works very well. And I was stirring up fish, but they were not taking it. Well, the father of the person who looked after this bit of fishing in Iceland, the guy had gone off somewhere. I don't know. His father was with me, and this chap was a man of few words, and he sort of shook his head when he's watching this, and he said no. And it was the same fly, and I got it. I hadn't got it tied on as a hitch. It was just straight through to a double hook, and it was a sunray shadow, very basic sunray shadow, and he just made me cast it sort of downstream and just let it swing in the surface with my rod tip raised, which that lifts it up into the surface, creating a bit of a wake. And I sort of thought, it's not going to work. The second cast, this head came up, and it was a take like a trout. Just the head just came up, it sort of porpoised and just went down on the fly. I lifted, and I'm into a 7 or 8 pound grilse. That was the first fish. Within half an hour, I think I'd had 2 more in the same pool in exactly the same way, and it was just mind blowing. And part of the problem is then that hitching is such a fantastic way to fish for salmon that if you possibly can, it becomes almost my favourite way of fishing for them if possibly can. I mean, the conditions aren't always right, the water isn't always right for it, but if it is, it's a wonderful way to fish because it's so visual. Again, it comes back to rather like chalk streams or clear water fishing. You see what's going on.
And have you done it much in the UK?
I haven't actually. I haven't. It's a good question. I've been told that certain places at certain times and I'm sure some of the rivers it would work on. Particularly, I've not fished very much on the rivers in the north of Scotland, the ones that are right at the north. But those rivers, I think, people do hitch quite a lot on those, and to great effect. But I haven't. My salmon fishing in Britain tends to be confined to latterly to the Tweed. I did say I had that spring trip to the Oikel, but the conditions weren't right there. Though I could imagine that the Oikel would, in the right conditions, would be superb for it, particularly the upper river. But those smaller rivers, I think, would work. It would work pretty well.
Yeah, I've tried it a little bit, not with success, but somebody who fishes the same water historically said to me they'd got it to work. And then I was chatting to somebody about it and thought, well, I wonder if part of having a riffle on the dropper and something small, if that might do something as well. I don't
Yeah,
know.
well, it might. I mean, I think the answer is it well might do, and try it. I did hear that somebody on the Upper Oikle tried that, basically that sort of technique with a sort of muddler, either on the dropper or, and that worked really well. And as I say, I think it'd be something that'd be fun in lowish water conditions. Something to experiment with. I'd have thought. Yeah.
No, I'm going to try that. I think I riffled a little bit last season because the water was so low.
Well, next season I am going to try it. I mean, annoyingly, I took a rod this season on a bit of the Usk, lower Usk, a salmon rod, and hopefully they'll ask me back next season, because I didn't actually manage to get down there myself at all. But I sent a friend on a couple of occasions, and he had the temerity to catch a fish, hitching.
Excellent.
Yeah. He is still a friend.
Yeah.
If he's listening.
Well, you can be.
He'll know who he is.
You can be attributed to that then. So
he actually also invites me to fish for trout on the Usk, and which is an amazing. That can be amazing.
Yeah, early season there is.
Early season, it can be quite special, and there's some big lumps in that river.
Absolutely. So what we've done here is establish that you are a hugely passionate, versatile angler. You're also a fishing instructor as well.
Well, I am a fishing instructor, but to be absolutely fair, I'm sort of a part qualified. I've managed to get my what used to be called provisional AAPGAI double-handed qualification. I think they've now called it the professional qualification.
Right.
I'm working on getting my advanced, and somehow or other I've been set up to go and take the advanced test a couple of times, and things have cropped up that have meant I've had to change my plans. But, and you've heard it here, folks, next summer I am either going to take it or blow up. So there's, I'm going to be working away over the winter on it a bit, but I do enjoy it, and I enjoy that. I think the thing about instructing is you learn a lot about yourself as well as a lot about casting and helping people, and I find it a very rewarding, funnily enough, a rewarding thing to do.
Good. Well, so I think we've established some wonderful credentials there, and what it brings me nicely along to is that you're Deputy Chief Executive for Salmon and Trout Conservation, and it used to be called just the Salmon and Trout Association, so you had a change of name there. But can you tell us a little bit about the organisation and the work they do?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the Salmon and Trout Conservation is, exactly as it says, focused on the conservation of wild fish and their habitats. And I mean, salmon in its various life stages is somewhat less so trout, because trout can cope with quite a range of conditions. But salmon require pretty good water quality and pretty good water quantity. So the bottom line is, if a river's fit will support a population of salmon, it will support anything else, is one way of thinking about it. And we're not sort of salmon snobs or anything like that, but the salmon is a bit of an indicator fish. That's how we see it. And our work is to look after Britain's rivers and foster wild fish. And to that extent, our remit extends to the near coast around our rivers. We do a lot of work campaigning to get fish farmers to clean up their act, because fish farming, well, in open cages is ecologically disastrous. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. Luckily, closed containment, i.e. farming fish with a physical barrier between the farm fish and the real world, is coming down the track, and won't turn up soon enough. But until then, we need to fight the Scottish Government to get proper regulation to protect wild fish from escapes and sea lice infestations.
Yep. And what route does that take? Is it I guess it's a long drawn out process.
It is a long drawn out process. How we work as an organisation is that we are, as I said, focused on wild fish and their habitats. We are a campaigning charity, and but we're evidence led. So we gather the evidence. We've done a lot of work on understanding the impact that salmon farms have in that context, and then yes, it's a matter of working away and effectively lobbying government to take wild fish into account, and you do that partly through social media, working with, in the case of salmon farming in the UK, which is mostly the west coast of Scotland, working with Scottish MSPs to get, and in the end we managed to get a parliamentary inquiry, which has been extremely helpful, and as a result of that, we are now gradually moving within the next year or so to have some legislation that will actually begin to make a difference.
Brilliant. And I guess you've had things like the Patagonia artificial film,
yes,
which has probably reached not only fly anglers but the general public.
That artificial film was really absolutely tremendously exciting, actually, and we were pretty involved in it, actually, and Patagonia sort of partly did that work on the back of listening to our views on and us telling the story about wild salmon over here. They were focused part, and the film is a fantastic film because it really does hit home on the issues involved. It's partly to deal with the specific Pacific salmon, and partly the Atlantic salmon and let's not forget sea trout. Yeah, and it was amazing. We were invited by Patagonia to go along to screenings of these films to answer questions. And it is so exciting and so sort of optimism building. I can't think of the right words really, but really fantastic. The audiences, I mean, there were a few people there who fished, but the audiences were young, sort of, and wide-ranging, massive different degree of social backgrounds and various sorts of interests. But it made me realise, and made the team at Salmon and Trout Conservation realise that the conservation word is extremely important in what we do, and that while fishermen are perhaps necessary to help save our watery environment, they're not sufficient. We've got to find, greater support elsewhere. And ultimately the pressure on things like salmon farming, and I'll come back to some of the freshwater work we do as well, is engaging with those sorts of conservation-minded consumers, because they're, the consumer has real power. Because if the consumer stops eating farm salmon in the same way the consumer stopped eating the worst sort of, the battery farm chicken in the 1960s and 70s because they were being farmed in an unregulated manner, that is transformative, absolutely transformative. And salmon and trout conservation is learning to work with, and that one of the great things about modern technology and social media is that, and we're learning the tricks of the trade, can have a huge impact and be hugely beneficial to the environment. So that's really exciting. And we've been doing this. So that salmon aspect is one of our major campaigns. Our other major campaign has been really focused on water in rivers, water quality and water quantity. Now, water quality, we've been using invertebrates, insects, flies, to tell us about water quality. Now, that's really interesting because fishermen have been bemoaning a decrease in fly life, and there's no doubt that fly life has decreased. I mean, it's still, from my point of view, it's a glass half full, not half empty. And the great thing about nature is that, and one of the things that keeps me going even in the darkest moments of some losing out to polluters in some shape or form, is that these rivers, given the chance, will bounce back. They are resilient, but they do need the opportunity to do that. But we discovered that a relatively cost-effective way of measuring water quality is to take invertebrate samples, kick sampling. So you're taking the insects before they've hatched out into the wing, into adults. They're in the water, and of course they are sampling the water 24/7. So they're working away full time on, and by taking a sample out of the river, pickling it in alcohol, the worst ways to go, and then taking it to the laboratory and analysing it down to species level, and looking at the, if you like, the composition or the of that sample, the different species, some of the species that are there, species that are not there. Scientists have calculated indices which allow you to form or get what they call a biometric, measuring biology, a fingerprint or a snapshot or readout of water quality at a particular site. So you're able to build this picture of what's going on in a river. And we've been utilising that. We did some professionally, and now we're rolling it out using using volunteers. And the volunteers come from across the spectrum. They're not simply fishermen. They are people who are concerned about the state of our rivers and our environment.
And people will know this as the Riverfly Census, or it's now called the Smart Rivers.
It's now called Smart Rivers, correct.
Rivers.
That's
right.
right.
And it's been going a couple of years.
Well, the Riverfly Census we
Probably
kicked
longer.
off. Let me think. Well, basically, I've been involved in it. I turned up at Salmon and Trout Conservation to do some work and help them on their chalk streams. We were measuring the amount of phosphate in chalk streams, and that sort of campaign was concluding. But I'd read somewhere about using invertebrates, and I thought this would be really interesting because fishermen are moaning about fly life, so it'd be really good to just carry out a Riverfly Census to just find out what's around. But it also turned out that so on the one hand, we could see what was happening to fly life and compare it where we could find records with the past in and of itself, but also it was telling us something, or potentially. And so we did this thing called the Riverfly Census using, when I say we did it, we didn't. And let's be clear, we're a lobbying organisation, so we don't do our own science. We get independent people to do it. And we got Dr. Nick Measham of Aqua Science, who's a well-known and much respected ecotoxicologist, as he calls himself, and freshwater biologist, to do the work. And having concluded that, we could only afford, with our budget, to do a number of rivers, but we really wanted to get this out there across the country so that it was generating data that we then, Salmon and Trout, could use as evidence to lobby the Environment Agency and others to up their game. So we have devised a sort of basically a system using volunteers, we're training people to take the samples, and then they can training them to either analyse them themselves or send them to basically Nick Measham or other specialists to get them analysed. And this we managed to raise some funds for this, and this is now in its second year.
And this isn't
it's
just
really
chalk stream; it's around the country.
No.
Isn't it?
Well, one of the, like I said earlier on, and fishing wise, and I live in the south on chalk streams, but it's for rivers anyway, and it's not just for chalk streams. And actually, as an organisation, we are conscious that there's a whole world outside the south of England, and certainly we're trying to change that perception. There is a perception that us fishing NGOs seem to be focused pretty much in the game angling arena on chalk streams or salmon in Scotland and nothing in between. And far from it. I mean, we are developing this on other rivers. We've got a group on the River Ribble, and we've got groups looking at it on the Axe, and so on. So, yeah, it's breakout. We're breaking out from the south of England.
Good. And it's interesting you say about that, because there was a couple of things that crossed my mind when we talk about hatches, and say we hear from people have been fishing a very long time, well, the hatches used to be like this. And I sort of positioned myself 15 years down the line saying, well, they were the golden days. Yet, when I've sat down and talked with people and the indication you've had, and from my neck of the woods, the hatches haven't been disastrous. I remember seeing the start of this year in February when it was warm, March browns like I've not seen before. I sat down with Gilly Bates. She was saying iron blues, which I believe are an indicator of
iron blues are
quality.
pretty sensitive to various forms of pollution. That's true.
Yeah.
No, they've been quite good. I mean, there've been some reasonable high iron blue hatches here, and even though it's been a difficult summer, there's been some spectacular blue-winged olive activity later on in the evenings. Both the spinners returning to lay eggs, but also the olives themselves hatching. They tend to like hatching at that time. It can be particularly frustrating fishing then, because the fish will flip from taking spent to taking the emerging olive, and they can be quite difficult. And by that time, of course, it's too dark to see what's going on, and inevitably, even with sort of magnifying lenses, it's impossible to change your fly.
Yeah,
usual nightmare. But no, actually, fly. I mean, it's mixed, and I think it's always been a bit like that. And actually, if you go back in history, I'm not denying that things probably were a lot better before the advent of modern pesticides, which is it is a big and pervasive issue. But people were always bemoaning fly hatches. The Houghton Club, who just fished, we're sitting on the banks of the Test here today, just downstream from us. They had a major panic in around about 1900 because they thought the mayfly had died out.
Right.
Of course, it hadn't. There'd just been one or two bad breeding seasons, I think, and these things go. But there are cycles in things. I think that, no one would argue that the trend hasn't been downwards, but a lot of the problems are now being understood, and at the margin, I think things are getting better.
So hopefully there is a chance that further down the line, when we're sitting in our old rocking chairs, that we may be saying, well, that was a good hatch today.
Yeah, I think so. And it was interesting. I've got some... the most wonderful thing about fishing for me, actually, is the friendships, the really, really fascinating friendships you develop and the people you meet. And I've got a great pair of mates. One who's based in Sheffield, or near Sheffield, Stuart Crofts, who I'm sure...
Mr. Caddis.
Mr. Caddis. And his partner in crime on the other Mr. Caddis, Andrew Dixon, based upon... Andrew's based on the Eden around Penrith. Both are very skillful fishermen, but now derive as much interest out of entomology as they do fishing, and are extremely, extremely knowledgeable. And Andrew will tell you that this season, as you were alluding to, on the Eden, the hatches are some of the best he's ever seen. So, it isn't all doom and gloom. And when Andrew came down to fish the chalk streams with me, again, he felt that he'd been down 3 years ago to carry out a light trapping survey of adult fly life on the Itchin in August with Stuart Crofts, and they'd seen very little, and it really was actually very disappointing because the conditions were really quite good and there wasn't much being caught by them. This time round, okay, he didn't do any trapping, but he felt there was a lot more fly life. And so I think it's fashionable to continue to decry and complain about the environment, and there's a lot that needs to be done, and there's certainly no way that Salmon and Trout Conservation could in any way be complacent, and we certainly wouldn't want our supporters to be complacent. But the amount of time and effort we're putting in is beginning, I think, to have some positive results. There's much more to do, so don't give up and keep sending the checks. But it is, it's nice to feel that the huge amount of effort that we put in is having some benefit.
And so going from that almost mildly positive, I guess, or hopeful, salmon, let's go, you've
Right.
alluded to that.
Yeah.
How do you see that right now? I guess
Well,
as we all do.
the salmon
but-
thing is really interesting. We're getting together with the Atlantic Salmon Trust, the Angling Trust, and the Game and Wildlife Conservancy. And funnily enough, next week we're launching a thing, an entity called the Missing Salmon Alliance. So I guess the name gives you a clue. Salmon populations have declined across the Atlantic, both in the northeast and on the in the northwest, on the US seaboard, fairly dramatically, and it is tough. What are the reasons for it? We don't fully know. So part of this exercise is to highlight the crisis, raise funding, which we're in the middle of doing, in order to carry out research to start to answer some of the questions. But in some areas also, we do know some of the problems. We know both here, well, in Scotland and now Iceland, and in the northwest of America, salmon farming, aquaculture is a big issue and a big negative, and that is, I think, gradually being tackled. So I think we might have passed the worst in terms of the impact that has had, and let's see what happens as the fish farmers clean up their act. But I'm positive about that. In other areas and other aspects, we're not so sure. One of the interesting things is that increasingly the scientists think that a big part of the problem is what's going on in the rivers, not just in the sea. And we're not sending enough smolts to sea because of in-river pollution, and some of it's subtle. And you might think the headwaters of the Dee or the Spey don't have a lot of pollution, but forestry has taken place. Farming methods are different. There are all sorts of pressures getting in. So we've been carrying out, rather, the Atlantic Salmon Trust have been carrying out some tracking studies, tagging smolts with little transceivers that get picked up when they go past these various receiving stations. And they've found that 50% of the smolts seem to disappear before they reach the sea or reach the estuary. The problem is we don't know, which sounds quite a lot. We don't know precisely how bad that is because we don't have a history of what's been going on in the past. But it's suggestive that we should be looking at what's going on in fresh water, and some of that will be water quality issues. And I guess we'll be doing more kick sampling to try and scope some of that out. The other side is, of course, predation, and I'm sure that plays a role. It'll be great to quantify what that role is, because obviously those of us in protecting salmon, which is an endangered species, many of us would, be happy to cull fish-eating birds if that is the appropriate, if they're in the frame, and that's fine. But again, it's evidence-led, and if we have that evidence, I think you'll have an understanding on the part of conservationists in general that sacrificing certain predators in order to protect the salmon is a fully justifiable thing. So, but coming back to the point, am I answering the question? A lot is being done. I'm optimistic that will have an impact. How big an impact, I don't know. But I'm not one of those people who's prepared to say that it's all down to global warming and that we just have to stand back and let it go. There's a lot of stuff going on that's got nothing to do with global warming, and the decline of salmon populations in the recent past is far more precipitate than you would expect, given the slight changes in global warming. So the answer is there are things going on. We're going to find out. We're going to give it our best shot to find out what they are. And then we are going to do whatever we can to turn it around. Because, like I said, if we can get it right for salmon, we get it pretty much right for everything else.
Do you think also, coming back to the salmon, that the food source is not there, or they've got to travel further, and fish are coming back later?
They could be issues. Those are all factors. Those could all be factors. You're right, and we don't know the answer to all of those things. Some of those things we'll be able to answer. Like I said, and I'm sure the food is a critical issue. I mean, fish farming consumes huge amounts of the same bait fish that predators like wild salmon at sea will eat. So, yeah, there are lots of things going on, and I'm sure we will struggle to deal with all of them. But if we can actually get some sense of which factors are having what impact and deal with some of them, it could be a huge thing actually. And certainly, to me, that is one of our absolute, as anyone interested in the watery environment in fish has got to be concerned about salmon, whether you fish for them or not. So that's and as we come out of Christmas, one thing I would like to say actually is that people ask, is there any form of smoked salmon that I can farm salmon I can buy with a clean conscience? The answer is the only salmon that you can buy with a clean conscience is that is farmed in what's called closed containment, and it is probably obtainable in the UK, but it's hard to find. The unfortunate fact is that any salmon that's farmed in open nets, for whatever reason or another, if you're really concerned about the environment, I'm sorry, you just have to not eat it. But smoke up those trout that you could catch in river, smoked trout, that's fine. And also you can get wild Alaskan salmon if you shop around, and it's a bit of a premium, but it's not a huge premium. But you are eating something from a sustainable population. So,
if we look at the salmon situation, say it does, I hope it doesn't, but say it continues to worsen. I've looked at rivers in the Pacific Northwest, and I think it happened in Norway that they've actually rested the rivers from everything.
Yeah.
Do you think that potentially could be something that we would have to think about at some stage in the proceedings?
Yeah. Well, I'm open-minded about it. I suppose in a way it's a longer. One way of looking at that would be it's a sort of continuum of catch and release from
yes,
no catch and release. So if you're going from catch and decease to total catch and release to no fishing. I think we've reached a point where pretty much we're in a world of, in wild salmon fishing, of catch and release, total release, without equivocation in my view, because I don't think the populations almost in any river could be called sustainable. We can have debates about that, and there are debates about it, and believe you me that we have quite vigorous debates, because some people are concerned, possibly rightly, that if you're not allowed to take salmon, people won't fish for them, and if people don't fish for them, they won't care about them, and so on. I don't believe that, and at the moment we are in this position where Salmon and Trout Conservation is broadly supports catch and release. We're nuanced in the sense that if we believe a river actually had a sustainable surplus, that'd be fantastic, and we would there condone, measured amounts of taking of salmon for consumption. But I don't think personally we're at that position, and so it's catch and release. Totally resting rivers. They've done it in Ireland when stocks have got really bad, and I think if the survival of the species is really at stake, then yeah, I would look at it.
Because I think it's the Thompson River in Canada. Like their run of steelhead was 300 or something, which sounds, and I'm not an experienced steelhead angler, but that doesn't sound like a lot of fish.
That's not.
So they've stopped fishing on them.
They've stopped, yeah. And I think it's probably the right solution in extremis, because okay, catching and releasing fish, there's no doubt that some of those fish that you release, it doesn't matter how, scrupulous you are in handling them, they're going to get stressed in certain conditions, and they're not going to survive. And studies have been done that show that a percentage of fish that are caught and then released aren't going to make it.
Do you think part of that as well, and we push very hard in the magazine, of the handling of fish, do you still think there is a little bit of naivety in some areas of how to, the fish on the grass held up and that sort of thing? Do you think there is?
I think there is actually. I think that ideally you don't take, in my view, you don't take them out of the water if you possibly can, and you play them fairly, I would say, toughly, or you get them to the net fairly quickly. And there are techniques you can use, side strain and so on, that enable you to do those sort of things pretty effectively. But having said all of that, people I know and Paul Knight, the Chief Executive of Salmon and Trout Conservation, who once worked as a fish farmer, so he knows the dark side, in inverted commas, he will say that you could actually handle fish. These fish are tougher than you think. But I suppose, why take the chance?
Yeah, if we exercise caution. Then that's a better way. I think the best one we carry again in the back of the magazine is the keep 'em wet principles. Yeah. And one of the things I always think about is hold your breath. If you're gonna, and I don't lift fish out of the water at all. But if you,
that's very good. Yeah, that's a good idea.
And that's a way to think about it. And I think that was a good tip from those guys there.
I try to sort of just leave them in the water. Yeah. I mean, to be clear, I do kill stock trout. I like smoking them and eating them. I also think that stocked fish, they don't tend to survive, particularly they certainly don't overwinter very well, and I tend to have this view that I'm not pro stocking myself, so I'm very happy to just remove them.
And so the Salmon and Trout Conservation, as you said, is a charity. How can people support that? Right,
well, how can people support it? Well, they can support it by engaging with what we're trying to do. I mean, and they can do that. The obvious way is to say, right, you can support it by joining us as a member, which is £55 a year. You get a magazine, and you get the pleasure of knowing you're supporting a wild fish conservation charity. They can. It doesn't have to stop there. If you feel like donating more, you can. So financially, people can support us financially, but also it's partly engaging, identifying with our message, sharing the social media, supporting our campaigns. As I said that in particular with regard to salmon and salmon farming, getting that out there and encouraging people not to eat farmed salmon helps build pressure on the agriculture industry to clean up its act. Ditto, I mean, another interesting area we've been working on is on the River Itchen. There's a salad washing plant, which not only washes watercress, but they bring in salads from all over the world, which of course have been treated with pesticides, and those pesticides get washed off into the river, and pesticides, our invertebrate monitoring has shown you that pesticides having a big impact. One main way to get the company to clean up its act, the Environment Agency is involved. On the back of the work we've done, they're seeking to change the company's discharge permit so that it removes pesticides. The company is trying to do that. But equally, pressure from the supermarkets, or ultimately from consumers, saying, well, we shouldn't be eating bagged washed salad. This is absurd. We should just be buying dirty salad and washing it ourselves, is the way to go. So again, in those sorts of ways, it's that engagement basically that we seek. So yes.
And that's you mentioned social media there. You know, if people can retweet, I guess,
Yeah.
share stuff like that, and spread the word.
That's
all
right.
helps the
All
cause,
of that
doesn't it?
helps.
Yeah, for everyone.
It helps everybody. But ultimately, we survive on the income that we get from membership, from donations, from grant giving trusts. But all of that, again, that's fantastic. But I would just say to people, go onto the website, have a look around, see what you think, and I hope that people would feel that what we're doing is worth supporting.
Fantastic. Well, is there anything else you want to mention about what you're up to at the moment? Because we started with you as a fisherman. You've given us a lot of information about the work that you're doing there, and I kind of want to finish with you as a fisherman. Is there anything else you'd feel that you would like to address while we're here talking?
I suppose we just the. Not, I mean, in a sense, as a fisherman, I'm enjoying my sport more than I ever have, and I've rediscovered coarse fishing as well, trotting a float with bread for roach, and a couple of years ago I managed to catch a 2 pound roach. I've yet to get anywhere near the 3 pounder level, but that was one of my proudest captures, I think, actually. So, in fishing terms, no, it's great. I'm very happy now. I used to do a fair bit of travelling for fishing. I still go to Iceland, particularly for the trout fishing, which is absolutely fabulous. I'm off again this coming summer. Salmon fishing, I really want to get. I'm at my happiest now fishing in rivers in this country. For the absurd reason that I see as part of my mission is to try and help turn around the decline in salmon stocks, and to that extent, I get a lot of pleasure out of catching things in our own rivers rather than sort of spend it. And an increasing number of people are thinking that way actually. So basically, fishing what's in front of us and making sure it's fit to fish.
I'm with you.
That's what I'm working on really,
Yeah.
and otherwise. As I say, I'm going to be increasingly busy with Salmon and Trout Conservation, the organisation, actually doing exactly that.
And so, is there somewhere that you would? What's the dream destination? Where would you really like? What would you like to visit that you haven't?
What are the dream destinations? Well, I think I would probably have a crack at some, because I've never done it. Some form of saltwater fly fishing, though I have a continual sparring match with Pete McLeod on this one, is that I really fancy bonefish and permit, and in particular I'm less excited by wrestling a GT or whatever, but no, that would be one thing I'd like to try. But other than that, I've had my happiest I've had some fantastic times fishing for steelhead in British Columbia, which is just a wonderful place to go. I'd do that a bit more. Trout fishing in Iceland, if you're talking about overseas destinations. But in this country, there's just so much wonderful fishing, and I'm pretty happy pottering around, I think, in the UK, to be honest.
That's music to my ears. I'm with you on that, I have to say. Nick, it's been a wonderful day all round fishing with you, being on the river with you, sitting, listening to the work the Salmon and Trout Conservation are doing, and I think that's a really nice place to wrap everything up and say a huge thank you to you, Nick, and thank you for sitting down, listening to the questions and speaking so eloquently about everything. It's been really great.
It's been great. It's been wonderful to talk to you two Pete. It's been absolutely great. And this is the first podcast I've done, so...
Well, you've done a great job. It's been, as somebody who sits and listens to them afterwards, I know this is going to be interesting. I know our listeners, and I hope they will find this really, really interesting as well. So I would like to say a huge thank you, Nick Measham, and I look forward with great excitement to the Salmon and Trout Conservation and the work that they're doing, and I will watch with great interest. And it's great to see people fighting the corner of fish over everything else, and I'm really pleased to hear that. So, Nick, thank you so much indeed for sitting down with me.
Pleasure.
And thank you very much indeed. This has been the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as me. As I always say at the very end of these podcasts, that the podcast is an offshoot of our hard copy magazine, Fly Culture. You can find the magazine on flyculturemag.com. Our magazine is quarterly. We're fiercely independent. We have no adverts. We concentrate on bringing a quality, what we feel is a quality magazine each quarter to people. We hope if you have a look at the website, you'll be able to see a little bit. I put articles up there so you get a sense and a feel of what the magazine is about. It shares really our love of fly fishing. It's not a how-to magazine. It's about the time we spend on the water, either alone or in the company of friends, and the experiences that we have along the way. And fish can sometimes be just a happy byproduct of that moment on the water. So if you are interested, flyculturemag.com. We're in the usual social media channels. You'll find us on Facebook. We keep that updated. Instagram and Twitter as well. So you can find us there and see a little bit more about that. So we hope you've enjoyed that one as much as me. And I'll be bringing you some more podcasts really soon. So this is Pete Tiger signing off from the Fly Culture podcast, and we'll speak to you soon.